So hello, everyone. My name is Kevin Listerio. I'm a senior application engineer here at Bentley Systems. And for the next hour or so, we'll be discussing annotation and civil labeler. So we'll just hop right into the agenda here. Quite a bit of content to go over, especially with a topic so robust as annotation, especially with the civil tools available specifically in Open Roads Designer. So we'll jump right in, just a brief discussion over some of the tools that are available and kind of the building blocks in terms of configuration aspects like the text favorites, annotation groups, and definitions. Between the general annotation tools and civil labeler that we'll get to towards the latter half of the presentation, we'll also go over some tips and tricks, or at least highlight those, along with some demos of some of the capabilities. And then we'll end with pointing to some resources, and hopefully there's time for a little bit of Q&A. But I know I have some colleagues on the side here answering questions as we go through. And then as Scott and some of the others have mentioned, we'll answer or try to follow up with anything that is left over. All right, so just as a general overview for civil annotation, in terms of the tools that are available, and I'm assuming that most, if not all, or most of the attendees for this session are familiar with the commands available, but I just want to highlight especially the red tools, right? Red within the text on the slide and actually in the ribbon from the screenshot, right? That's our civil labeler, element annotation, and drawing model annotation. But just want to also point out for anyone who wasn't aware, we still also include the microstation functionality for notes, right? Placing notes, text, and even label. So element annotation, I know that we're, again, from a usability standpoint, that's for an element versus drawing model annotation for the drawing production side. But separate from that, with the assumption that there is a level of familiarity with those tools and how to use them, what I really want to focus on for the initial portion of this discussion is what's highlighted in this flowchart, and primarily focusing on annotation groups, annotation definitions, and text favorites. Now, for context, at the way top of this graphic, we see feature definitions. And for anyone who has used any of our OpenX products, and specifically Open Roads Designer, we know how important using feature definitions are within our design software, which is relatively different than just stand-up microstation drafting. Feature definitions are vastly important because it controls the feature symbology, which is a term we use that more or less describes or configures how a particular element will look on the screen, on paper, or within the actual DGN. So in terms of its level, line style, weight, also defining what type of element it is between an alignment or a geometry point or geometry line versus a terrain or even drainage and utility element, right? So it controls all of that on the side that isn't highlighted, but it also, or at least it being the feature definition, also can be configured with a default annotation group. So that's where element annotation and drawing annotation comes into play. What's pre-configured there, and that can be tweaked on the fly. So we'll start with kind of working our way from the bottom up in terms of what's highlighted here for text favorites. So I'm not going to go through a lot of examples for creating text favorites because there are resources separate from our session here that's already publicly available. But what I do want to highlight on this particular slide is the text favorite manager. So within Open Roads Designer, especially within the newer releases, I should say, the usability of the text favorite manager has been greatly enhanced in terms of some functionality enhancements to the various field types and subtypes and so on. But just overall, in this text favorite manager, you can build directly a text favorite, whether it's static text or computed text fields, using the select element option, which we'll highlight here in a demo. But we can also save off the text favorite directly in whatever file you have open, whether it's a Scratch file or an actual design model, or if you're in charge of developing organizational standards in a DGN library. right? And then we can test that. So let's just take a look at some tips here before we look at the demo. But I already alluded to that first bullet point, the ability to create text favorites in any working DGN file. And then there's workflows or enhanced workflows that we'll highlight where we can easily copy a text favorite into a DGN library using the load temporary library function. Another tip, maybe you already do this. Sometimes newer users aren't even familiar with the concept, but you can use the delivered examples as a starting point, whether that's the Open Roads Bentley delivered workspace, loading that or using that as an example rather than reinventing the wheel. But also the same concept goes for any organizational or agency standards. So using what's delivered as a starting point and then tweaking according to whatever you're trying to accomplish. And then the select element button, again, hopefully something that most users are familiar with. Otherwise, we'll highlight that in a moment, as well as kind of the workflow for testing using the place label command. So let's just take a look here, a really brief example, but I have some sort of alignment, geometry. It also has a feature definition assigned, and I'm accessing the text favorite manager. So what we can do is copy from the workspace standards that are already loading within my active session here, and I can copy from the overall DGN library, right? Or I can create a brand new text favorite within the manager, save it off, again, local to my particular file, and I can use that select element function to then literally pick an element there in the design view, whether it's referenced or live in the DGN, which then populates this property dialog box that I can select a particular property line to then develop a smart and dynamic text field from which we can adjust either the formatting and add, let's say, some static text to just differentiate from the provided workspace standards, can save that off, and then use the place label tool, right, the MicroStation place label, configuring it to that text favorite that was customized and placing relative to the element I want to annotate. Again, from a testing perspective, just to see that it populates the correct information and updates dynamically according to any adjustments to the geometry or the properties themselves. All right. And then same concept goes for drainage and utilities. I have just one structure here placed roughly, where again, we could copy from the provided standards, or in this case, again, create another entry local to my file. Let's call this an actual design file or an annotation specific DGN, where again, I'm using the select element option to make it easier to track down the information I'm trying to annotate dynamically, right? Otherwise, we could go through the field type and field subtypes of the text favorite manager itself to track down the same information, but the select element kind of speeds up that process. And then I can save it off and again, test within the place label tool. Again, just for drainage and utility elements. So for nodes, conduits, catchments, etc. And as you would expect, because this is a text field, it should update to any property adjustments and so on. So now from that, creating the text favorite, at least in this example, fairly straightforward, but the common question or follow-up question is how do we leverage that for additional models, or how do I integrate that within my workspace? And that's where this right-click functionality I alluded to, where you can access from the Open Road standards in your Explorer called Load Temporary Library, where you can literally right-click, select that option, and browse to find the DGN that contains any custom text favorites or other workspace aspects. So in this case, from doing that right-click load of the previous file I was working in, notice now in the Explorer, it actually populates within the library standards, which also means it populates in our text favorite manager. And this is something that hadn't been available prior to this functionality being included in, I believe, 10.10 or 21 R2. So from here, I can use what has already been created. I don't have to recreate that same text favorite. Let's say it was created by a colleague who shared their file or I have access to their file, and I can just load their resources through that right-click function, and then I can edit as needed from there. Or I can use that same exact workflow to integrate something that's separate from the workspace within the actual DGN libraries and workspace standards. All right, so text favorites aside, that will be a common thread, the baseline, if you will, in terms of what's powering a lot of the dynamic text moving forward. So text favorites can be plugged into annotation definitions. Annotation definitions can be grouped together, for lack of a better term, within an annotation group, and all of which is accessible from or within the Project Explorer, right? So depending on the type of element, whether it's an alignment versus a survey point and a drainage and utility node, you can configure respective annotation definitions and groups to those respective feature definitions. Right. So just to elaborate a little bit more, I know this is a very terminology-driven presentation. So again, I'll point you to some resources for anyone who's kind of newer to the topic compared to more experienced. But in terms of element annotation, we think about that command, right? Annotating an actual element. Well, the text that displays or the annotation that displays is predicated on the annotation group that is assigned to that feature definition. So it's just exposed. Very common example, the stationing feature, or excuse me, annotation group relative to its feature definition, right? You can see that from that screenshot. Compared to drawing model annotation, right, where that's configured respective to the drawing seeds that may vary depending on the type of sheet that you're trying to cut. So plan versus profile versus cross-section. And all of which here, you notice that there's drop boxes for these properties, if you will, or the parameters. So you can potentially adjust the default annotation group or overwrite it upon using the actual annotation tools, both element annotation and drawing model annotation. All right. So in general here, several annotation group tips, again, similar to text favorites. They're stored and accessible, or pulled from, I should say, from a DGN library. So with that, when you use an annotation group, it actually gets branded to your file. So you kind of have a local copy of that annotation group separate from the workspace, from which you could access and manage and potentially adjust local to your file if needed, right? But same thing as text favorites, you can create and test these in any working DGN file, whether that's a live model or a scratch file. And you can also use the same load temporary library function to pull additional resources in. One thing to be very wary of, and quite honestly, this is a common, frequently asked question in terms of how annotation groups and definitions work, or I should say a support ticket. Be very careful when you copy an annotation group overall, because all that an annotation group is a collection of individual definitions. So the point being, if you copy an annotation group, that doesn't make a copy of the individual definitions themselves. So the standard workflow is copy the group and the particular definition you're trying to adjust so that you're not affecting any other groups that might be using the same definitions. Now, one of the last points here on this slide that I'll highlight is the text location management enhancement to the product, or at least to annotation groups. That's also referred to as white space management as well, I think, within our documentation. But from ORD 2021 R2 on, there's a new field that has been included. So let me actually demo this. So again, from 1010 on, I believe. So a standard example, annotating an alignment or a center line piece of geometry, and then we see the stationing and all the relevant text, the tick marks, the curve data, the cardinal points, bearings, etc. So the standard workflow, again, is with curve data especially, we try to move that out of the way if it's clashing with any other annotation from separate files. But the moment we make a design change down the line, which is inevitable, that annotation reverts back, right? It's following the annotation definition settings for the offset from whatever element it's annotating, right? So again, for white space management or text placement management, within the definition, we can track down a property, and we have left and right arcs here that we can manage. There's this property line under the text section, right? Where manage modification was previously set to false. If I toggle it to true, I could even test or look at the preview, I should say, within the view field here in the manage annotation window. You can see potentially what this definition looks like. But again, I'll make that same adjustment to the manage modification toggle for both left and right arcs, setting that to true. And what that actually does is it's processing in the background. It's reprocessing the same group since it's used in the design file, or at least live in this file. And now when I go ahead and manually move, or if I want to retain the placement of this text, from the quick properties, if I click and hover, that little drop down at the top of the properties window is now made available from the manage modification toggle, right? So I set that to relative, I believe. So it's going to maintain its relative spacing from the piece of geometry or the element, regardless of any design changes, right? So whether I adjust the radius value or dynamically move the PI, it still maintains its relative placement after I already manually moved it. So similar concept for this other curve. If I change the default to a fixed location, now it is fixed in space. So as you would expect for any design changes, that curve data, that block of text, if you will, maintains its location, right? Regardless of any design changes I make at this point, as long as the geometry is intact and as long as I don't remove and replace that annotation group, that should remain or follow whatever setting I impart. Okay, so again, white space or text location management, just be aware of that, especially for your, or specifically for any plan callouts related to annotation groups. All right. Moving on to Civil Labeler. Let me just take a look at the time. All right, so for basically the rest of our session here, I will be focusing on Civil Labeler in terms of not necessarily how to use the tool, but again, kind of looking at the structure of it and so on. But just to create the baseline level of knowledge, right? Overall, Civil Labeler was introduced in ORD 2021 R1 10.10, right? And it was introduced as a tech preview, and that's important to note because all the attendees of this session you might be using or have to, and rather required to use this particular version compared to a newer one, right? So pay special close attention to the version that you're using. But a clear indicator of Civil Labeler, actually, let me get to that on the next slide. Overall, Civil Labeler supports complex labels, right? Complex labels that all of our other annotation tools up until this point wasn't able to support. So this also includes being able to dynamically and interactively select properties such as leaders and frames on the fly for spot annotation. That's what this tool is used for. So trying to label station offsets with or without frames and leader lines and so on, having that leverage text favorites as well, and being able to override other display options on the fly. That's more or less what Civil Labeler allows us to do, along with allowing us to label more complex situations, which we'll take a look at some examples. But going back to what I was alluding to before, depending on the release of your version, you'll be able to note whether or not you're using the tech preview of Civil Labeler versus the newer and enhanced available Civil Labeler. If your your tool is XML based versus DGN lib based. So it'll either say XML on the top of the actual dialog box or not. So main point here, the latest and newer versions of ORD leverage and use DGN library-based files to manage the civil label definitions. And this makes it a lot easier to access, to manipulate or tweak from the end user perspective and from the workspace or CAD admin perspective rather, right? In terms of the dialog box, if you look at the screenshot, the organization of kind of that left palette will vary depending on the agency standards you're using, right? But more or less, it will be broken out per type of sheet, more or less, for plan, profile, and cross-section, and also maybe type of element. So between drainage and utilities and survey, for example, right? And then the main configuration area, again, this is the tool from the end user perspective when they kick off the tool in ORD. There's lots of options, which we'll go through, and that's kind of what we'll spend most of our time here discussing, both the setup and application of these various toggles. So very robust tool, but just a really quick example here. Have some intersecting geometry. I have the labeler tool already kicked off, and I'm using a name with leader. So the leader and frame is already set within the label definition. I just pick the geometry and place it. It's pulling or leveraging, I should say, text favorite. So as you would suspect, if I go ahead and change, let's say, the name of this element, then that should propagate, right? So that's a very simple example, but again, just being able to dynamically set up kind of the look and feel of the label and apply it quickly. That's, again, part of the benefit of using this tool compared to the MicroStation place label commands and place text. All right, let's look at a more complicated situation, right? So we have intersecting geometry. Let's say I want to label the station relative to that intersection point. Civil Labeler can do that. It pulls in, again, whatever's configured in the text favorite that's configured, then imparts whatever data it finds. Another example off of, let's say, this east-west main line, maybe need to call out a particular station offset, elevation, etc. for this particular point. Again, finding all of that information dynamically and quickly. And then another example here for a point label relative to some geometry. Using a leader line and frame that's preset, but of course we can change that on the fly. We no longer need that frame and or the leader. And the label overall is dynamically tied. All right. So again, just brief example there to provide context for anyone that isn't familiar with the tool up until this point. Because now we'll shift our focus to configuring a civil label definition. Configuring in terms of a CAD management perspective, but also what the civil label is comprised of. So the actual end result of the civil label, it has a couple key points here, and specifically the anchor point there at the bottom left of the graphic. So that's the origin point from which it's computing any fields and so on, which is very important to retain. There's the overall text, of course, coming from either text favorite, static text, so on. And then the other things that are called out here are all optional, as you can see from, or might have recalled from the actual dialog box. So the leader can be optionally used, frame and divider as well. There's different shapes for the frames, different orientations for the dividers, and so on. Now, focusing on the actual manager for the civil labeler. So how to actually configure one of these labels or manipulate one that might be provided to you in the workspace. Again, remember from 10.11 on, Civil Labeler is DGN library based. So with that, we are able to access label definitions from the Explorer, and that's what the screenshot is depicting here. In this case, I'm in an actual DGN library within that screenshot, and I can browse down to label definitions, find the actual label definition I want to view or manipulate, do a right-click manage, and pull up the Civil Labeler Manager. So in terms of the manager itself, there's several different things to be aware of. Well, first, just the look and feel, the UI, if you will, of the label manager is different than the end user experience, right? So this manager actually has two tabs that we'll focus on. So first being the label, second being placement, right? But under the label tab, this is where the text favorite can be configured, right? This is the only area where we can adjust at the current moment the actual text favorite associated to the label definition. So then the way I understand this, and we'll walk through it within the next couple slides, but the way I look at this is from the top down. So I plug in a text favorite that I've configured or that's provided, and then we see target fields or text fields and a sample of what that text favorite is trying to generate. We can develop the prompt type of how to actually place this particular label. Sometimes it's one click, sometimes it's multiple, right? And then we can also help define or specifically define steps for the end user to follow for placement, right? So user-defined prompts that pop up at the cursor for the end user, right? So we'll break this down a little more in terms of the text favorite and the fields here. Oftentimes between the naming, like target 1 and 2, it can be confusing because they might be related to the same element. But again, the way that I look at it is from the top down in terms of the text favorite, a preview of that text favorite in the area, and then the respective fields associated to those. So in this example, the white text coming from the text favorite is static, right? Within the Civil Labeler itself, I can't edit the text here because it's coming from the text favorite predefined. Right, so if I need to make those changes, we'll go to the text favorite manager. But between the white text and colored text, the colored text is really related to the text favorite fields that are configured, right? So in this case, the name and station, that's off of one element. So notice the prompt type, right, as we move down there. Sometimes the multiple targets, they may be related to the same element. That's where the drop-down functionality comes into play. Just have to hit the drop downs and just take a look at what's available, right? And then in terms of the prompts, key in some direction that's concise, but also descriptive enough to impart how to actually place this label. All right, let's move on to the next tab. So the placement tab, this is, again, it has various drop downs, let's call it, and the configuration aspects that you can preset, right? So this will be the preset properties when the end user actually uses the Civil label for their plans production, right? So the one thing I want to focus on here and just highlight is the location method, that dropdown. So I have a screenshot here of both the dropdown for the location method within the Civil Labeler Manager, and kind of just a screenshot of the already help. Now, for the sake of time, I'm not going to walk through every single one of these options and its definitions, some of which are a little more intuitive than others, right? But my main point here is within the the Civil Labeler Manager, we set the location method only here. So the end user can't adjust this on the fly. That's my main point. But I also want to highlight the cross-section 2 points location method. That is a newer one, depending on the version of ORD that you're using. So I just wanted to highlight that. I believe that was included in 2022 R1, right? So being able to place labels between 2 points, very similar to kind of the dynamic cross-section temporary labeling that you can do in that viewer. So it's by point with your cursor, and then it calculates the value and displays whatever is defined there within the text favorite, right? So just, just wanted to highlight that there. All right. So in terms of placement now, so we just went over the setup for civil labels, so the configuration, if you will, of a civil label definition. So now we're switching our attention to or focusing on the end user perspective. What does this look like for placement, and what are the various toggles I was alluding to that we need to be aware of to make the experience and the end result of the placed text more manageable. All right. So again, notice this dialog box, or the screenshot of it, doesn't have two tabs. This is the actual tool itself actioned within, an active session of ORD, right? So I can see all the available label definitions coming from the workspace. And then within the main area, notice location method. There's no drop down there, like I mentioned earlier. So that's already preset. And then there's other options here that we can manipulate related to what the label will look like and how it will be rotated and associated to the elements. And that latter part I just mentioned, that's really what I'm focusing on, kind of the bottom half of this main area of the dialog box, starting with the rotation options. So rotation relative to the text, or the call out, if you will, and the element being labeled. We have dynamic justification, all these various toggles here that I'm highlighting that we'll go ahead and break down and expand upon. All right. So all these names might have clicked through it a little too quickly for you to read. Again, if you used your cursor and just floated on those various tiles, or those little toggles rather, you'll see the name exactly. And of course, you could always look up the help documentation. There's actually a summary on one single page. You just need to search for. But that can be defined or helpful, at least as an additional resource. But separate from that, what I want to start with is going back to horizontal, or at least the rotations, right? So if I hit that drop down, the bigger screenshot here, that's the available options to date, I believe. But what I wanted to highlight here is the bottom view horizontals, verticals, and iterations, right? So one thing to note related to those view horizontals and verticals, if you're familiar with that terminology in the product, what that really means is, do I want the text to remain horizontal or vertical relative to the view? So when it's initially placed, if my view is rotated according to the sheet, do I want that text to rotate as well? So the note here is that when you use a leader line, it doesn't retain the view horizontal as you would expect. So in other words, when you're using view horizontal or vertical, don't use a leader line. Otherwise, you might get skewed results, right? I just wanted to highlight that. But moving on within that section, lock perpendicular. This one, at least in my opinion, is a little more intuitive than maybe some of the others. But lock perpendicular just causes the label to be locked perpendicular to the actual element. It's kind of wordy as a definition, but you will easily see kind of the experience when you have that toggled on and use it. When you go and label, you'll see the exact output from that particular toggle. Compared to some of these other ones, let's go through the bottom section here. Just keeping an eye on the time. Looks like we're good. We'll start with dynamic justification. So this is justification related to the text itself when you go and actually place this particular label. So do we want the text to be justified automatically or not? So in this example, right, initially here, I won't toggle on dynamic justification, so it's off. I'm calling out a point. So notice as I move my cursor, the text retains its left justification, right? It doesn't justify according to the leader line compared to when it's toggled on. So it's a very small difference, but it may matter in terms of, CAD standards and so on, right? So that's dynamic justification, the actual text aligning with the leader line. Moving on, we'll go to talk about view independent rotation. Again, in terms of the names of these toggles, you could float with your cursor on top of which will display the name of the toggle. But when view rotation or view independent rotation is enabled or toggled on, then the label will hold its orientation even when the view is rotated versus when it's disabled, the placed label will rotate with the view. Right, so view independent rotation. So in this instance, I'll first place a note here or a call out relative to that same point with view independent turned off, and then I'll rotate. Right, so it's horizontal to that initial view, but no longer horizontal when it's rotated, compared to, go ahead and delete this, toggle on view independent rotation, or I'll just leave that actually in view just to compare. So again, horizontal to the initial view, and then rotate the view. Notice the second placement rotates along with the view, right? So again, that's view independent rotation. Next up, view readable. So when this is enabled, the text will automatically rotate to be readable, I believe from the bottom or the right, as the element rotates or as the view rotates, right? So let's just take a look at that. So initial placement again, let's see, I won't use the toggle. I'll place the bearing or the call out overall, right, relative to the element. Let's say the geometry changes in this case. So its actual bearing adjusts. And as soon as it passes kind of that threshold, notice it's still following along its initial placement and orientation. So it's not as readable if this was the actual horizontal view of, let's say, the plan sheet. So let's try that again. Go ahead and toggle on the view readable. Go ahead and place the same call out here. And then as we surpass that 90-degree threshold, if you will, notice how the text rotates relative to the side it was initially placed so that it is now readable. Right, again, another particular toggle there to just be aware of. And again, most of which these are preset on the label definitions that are provided to you from a workspace. But the main point here is you can manipulate on the fly if the result is not, or at least you're not producing the result that you wish to produce. All right, next up, annotation scale. This should be familiar for most power users within MicroStation and ORD, right? Do we want the text to be annotation scale aware or not, right? So for this example, we'll place our call out with it toggled off. So it's placing at the actual size of the text defined in the text style, right? So very small. It's not recognizing any scale or factor compared to when it's toggled on. Then the annotation in the text becomes aware, gets scaled up relative to the active drawing scale, I should say. Right, we're just demoing various scales here, not really placing anything. So I think 1 to 10 next. You can see how the overall size of the text in the annotation scale interacts. All right, next up, element association. All right, so when this isn't enabled, the text associated, or the text is associated to the element. So this one, at least terminology-wise, that's how I remember it. Do I want the text to be associated to the element or not? Sometimes I don't in certain instances, all right? But what we also need to be aware of is this particular toggle also exposes other toggles in the toolset from this bottom right area, which we'll discuss moving forward. So it's related to relative spacing and rotation, but alone, element association just controls the association of the piece of text with the element. So I'll go ahead and action it here. Actually, in this instance, it has not toggled on. So I placed the bearing with element association toggled off. So notice it essentially is just retained in the initial space or location it is placed when element association is turned off, right? So with that toggled on, you would find that it would move with the piece of geometry in that instance. All right, next up, or next to that, is annotation association, all right? So this is specific to when we're using leader lines, or at least that's the way I understand it, within civil labeler placement. So if I'm using a leader line, every single time I'm going to have this toggled on, because when it's enabled, it associates the leader line to the element being called out, versus if it's toggled off, we'll find here as the geometry updates kind of the end result of that. So currently, place that with a leader line, annotation association toggled off. So notice as the geometry updated or changed, essentially or effectively removed the leader line or broke it, in my opinion. The text should still remain in terms of dynamically reading off of the element and properties. But now with annotation association toggled on, as you would expect, the entire piece of annotation, including the leader line, is retained. It moves, it updates relative to the view. All right. So moving on, relative association now. And the way I remember this is the relative association or relative setting similar to white space management. So I want the spacing to be relative to the object that's being called out, right? But with relative association and the toggle next to it, which is, or at least the rotation association, which we'll talk about next, it's one or the other for these toggles, and we'll see why. So with relative association, this specifically enables the annotation to move, but it doesn't rotate relative to the geometry, right? So let's actually just take a look at that. It's probably stand from the demo. So we'll place the bearing label and note with relative association toggled on. Go ahead and adjust the line work, and notice the text moves with it relative to the line work, if you will, right? But it doesn't rotate. And that's what relative association does. It will move, but it will not rotate. It will maintain its relative spacing from wherever you initially place it, but again, not rotate. Now, the other toggle, rotation association, remember it's one or the other when we're placing. This will move and will rotate. So notice as I toggle on rotation association, I'm not able to pick the other option. Go ahead and place the same piece of text here, civil label, just the bearing of the geometry, and see that the text aligns with the rotation as well as moves with the overall piece of geometry in this example. All right, oftentimes that's one that's used more commonly, but there's certain instances where we don't want that type of association. All right, coming to the end here, at least in terms of these various toggles, and then we'll talk about some tips and tricks. Repetitive placement. This is, again, a newer functionality. I don't recall what release, but if you see these checkboxes, just note that you can use them, again, on the fly. Sometimes they're just automatically checked off here. But this assists with kind of bulk annotation for Civil Labeler. Otherwise, as you can tell, Civil Labeler is very spot and location driven, or at least spot placement, I should say. So in the instance that you have multiple points using the same exact civil label definition or that you're trying to call out, rather than individually placing, which of course doesn't take that much time, right? You can use a selection set or a fence and action and place the label relative to geometry, just data pointing in space, and then manipulating the placement from there, right? You can still access the text field. You could change some of the settings. Now, I wouldn't want to do that for hundreds of callouts, probably adjust that from the text favorite itself. But overall, just wanted to show you the flexibility involved. And of course, with that method, you'll also be able to retain any design changes, right, relative to those points or anything else that's called out. So, again, getting to the conclusion here, at least for the presentation, some Civil Labeler tips and tricks I want to highlight. This first one, I'm not sure if you're all aware of the pop-up menu. Hopefully you are. That's the space bar within your design view, or your design view area, or your model view. So the space bar has been enhanced to include a recents tab, and it also includes not just MicroStation drafting tools, but under the recents tab, notice it populates Civil Labeler. So some of those civil design tools and plans production tools even. So rather than having to move your cursor back up to the ribbon to kick off the tool every time you close out of it, you can use the space bar in the pop-up menu under the recents tab, right? Very similar to some of the other tips and tricks we've discussed, but using and loading workspace standards as a starting point within a test file whenever you're trying to manipulate or even create these civil labelers from scratch. As you can tell, there's lots of things to configure for a civil label. It might be a little bit of legwork to get or to start from scratch. So you can use whatever's provided to you as a starting point and then tweak from there. And then you can also use the load temporary library function, that right-click functionality from the Explorer, to be able to pull resources from colleagues or from another workspace or from another design file from a different project, right? Just being able to quickly and easily reuse what has already been developed. That's I found very helpful with the load temporary library. Again, civil labels are DGN lib based, at least from or for the newer versions of the software compared to XML based. So that makes it a lot easier to edit within your design files. So one point here is very similar to using a feature definition in a DGN model, like a live model. The civil labels get branded to your file the moment that you use them. So branded meaning it essentially is a local copy of some workspace standard within your active DGN, from which you could make a copy of and edit, or edit directly as needed, right? And then this last bit, don't forget about the cross-section navigator tool. You can actually use that to maneuver about the cross-section drawing models, to place spot labels, or to just navigate, right? Other than, view groups or the models dialog. Just wanted to point that out there. So let's take a look at some of this stuff. So at least from that previous example, we placed a lot of station offset callouts, right? So from the Explorer, you can see there's the station offset civil label under the label definition section. So right-click manage. So this is managing and editing the actual default properties, where I could change, let's say, the text favorite. I can even open up the text favorite manager directly by hitting that A icon. Maybe I use some of the custom stuff I may have developed from earlier, like in our demo, or I could load a temporary resource and so on. I could copy what has been initially branded in this file coming from the workspace so that I don't mess with what is standardized, and I can easily differentiate between the two or three or whatever you're trying to configure here and use. All right. There's the pop-up menu. So in my active view, hitting the space bar, I can kick off the civil labeler command rather than having to move my cursor up to the ribbon. Incremental time saving, but still time saving. You can see in the tool there's the quick custom, quote unquote, civil labels that I just copied there from the Explorer, already exposed. And then to just highlight, there's the load temporary library function, right? Where then through that, I can browse for another file from another project, workspace even, and use it as a starting point, or use a civil labeler from that DGN as a starting point rather than starting from scratch. So in conclusion here, there's lots of things to go over. Again, I definitely tried to fit as much as I could within the 50-minute time span that I was allotted. But overall, don't forget about our resources, the standard stuff like Bentley communities, of course, the Bentley LEARNserver that's been updated, learning.bentley.com, as well as our YouTube product pages. And especially with some of the enhancements that Derek presented on day one related to Open Roads Designer 2024, be on the lookout for the YouTube content for what's enhanced, right? as well as our product documentation. But I also want to highlight these particular links here that are shown on the slide. So the one on the left, this is coming from the Bentley communities. It's the Workspace and Standards Development for ORD knowledge base, or previously known as a wiki, I believe. So just pay special attention to that, or look it up if you don't have that bookmark, because this has a robust amount of information related to workspace development holistically, but it is broken out to include very in-depth knowledge and demos on how to configure civil labelers or civil labels, for example, section 24, if you can see that, an overall annotation for different types of elements, and kind of that configuration flowchart we initially showed at the beginning of the presentation. And then I also just want to close here with civil ideas. I haven't taken a look at the questions that might have populated throughout the discussion here, but I think early on I even saw a couple that have already been suggested on the Open Civil Ideas portal. So if you aren't aware of that, I'm not sure if we're able to provide links in the chat, but maybe this deck will be available. You can use the hyperlinks here. But for those who aren't aware, this is a forum for your feedback and for your input related to all of our open civil products, let alone Open Roads Designer. So take a look at that.